Hey there, John Morris here, johnmorrisonline.com. Welcome back to another tutorial here. This one, I'm going to be talking about how to add featured images to an RSS feed. And this sort of came up because I was messing around with this today. And there's some plugins out there that do this, but I try not to add plugins that do a lot of extra things that I don't really need. Some of them you had to sign up for an account to get some of the stuff that I needed and so forth. So I decided just to go ahead and write a quick plugin that was going to do this for me. Now, there's lots of, I'm going to be adding this via enclosures. There's lots of different reasons or different types of enclosures you might want to add. Here I'm doing images, but you might want to do, say, a MP3 file for podcasts, or there could be other reasons why you might need this. I happen to need it for a service that I use that helps me to, when I post content to my site, helps me to distribute out to certain platforms, and I wasn't picking up the image URL. The service wasn't picking up the image URL from my RSS feed, so I wanted to go and explicitly add it as an enclosure so it would pick it up. So anyway, that's why I built it, but again, this will give you some insight or some training on just building WordPress plugins in general and hooks and that sort of thing. Now, before I get into this, if you do, as I sort of always mention, if you want the source code for this, I make the source code available to Patreon's patrons only. So if you want to become a patron, get the source code for this, plus all my past tutorials, access to all my current and future courses that I release. You can learn more about that at johnmorrisonline.com/Patreon. All right, so a little setup here. I have my plugin header already built here. I don't really want to necessarily go through that in this. If you're unsure about what you need to do in order to get the plugin header, you can just Google WordPress plugin header. This first one here that says file header, it has it right here for you can just really copy it, or you can sort of read through this. If you're going to be building WordPress plugins, I recommend reading through some of this stuff here just so that you know what you're writing when you do this sort of thing. But I've kept mine pretty simple, just the name, the URL, the description, version, all that sort of stuff. And that's what makes it so when you upload it into your WordPress plugins folder, it'll show up in the WordPress backend and so forth. All right, so let's go ahead and sort of talk about how to do this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up my class, because this is pretty standard, at least for me, across the different plugins that I create. So first, I always like to create them inside of a class. I think that's pretty much the recommended way of doing things at this point. And I'm going to give this one a name of RSS featured images. Of course, you can name it whatever. And I always wrap it inside an if class exists so that we don't have any collisions. And I'll just copy this. All right, so that gives us our basic class structure, and then I always come down here and we'll just sort of instantiate this class. We haven't written anything in it yet, but that'll just get us sort of set up. We're going to want, I sort of know what I'm going to need because I already wrote this plugin once, but I generally always for plugins have a constructor. And in that constructor is where I'm going to do all of my hooks. Okay, so basically the idea behind that is when you instantiate an instance of the class here, your constructor is going to run, and inside of this, we're all going to have all of our action or filter hooks that are then going to reference methods inside the rest of our class. That's pretty much how I always build my plugins, unless there's some reason not to do that. It just sort of helps keep everything self-contained. It's a little more organized. I also know that I'm going to need the actual method here that we're going to use, so that will do all the heavy lifting for us. So I'm just going to call this add image. You could call it whatever. But those are going to be our two main functions: our constructor, where we put our hooks, and in this case it's one hook, and then our actual method that does all of the work here. Okay, so one of the big questions that right off the bat you would probably be wondering with this sort of thing is, okay, with WordPress, you have functions, sort of PHP functions that you write, and you'll use sort of WordPress built-in functions inside of those. But then you also have to take whatever you write and you have to hook that into WordPress. And WordPress has action and filter hooks. And oftentimes the name of the game when it comes to writing a WordPress plugin is just figuring out what hook to use. So you might be wondering, well, how do you figure out what hook it is that we want to use? And all I really did was so a couple things. I had looked for other plugins and I tried some of the other plugins that were out there. I looked at there was some stuff on GitHub that I looked at. And so I had an idea of some different hooks that could be used for this, but ultimately ended up just Googling WordPress hook RSS item. So what is the WordPress hook that I need to use for an individual RSS item? Because I want to add this enclosure to each item. And of course, you can read through some of this stuff and get some ideas, but ultimately we have this one down here. And I usually, when I see codex pages like this, I go to that first. And if we click over into this, you can see it describes this. It says it can be used to echo data into the feed if necessary. You'll actually see right here, it says adds an image node to your RSS2 feeds. Well, that's pretty much exactly what I want to do, except I'm not going to do an image node. I'm going to do an enclosure. But this pretty much code right here is sort of a foundation of what we need here. So seeing that, then I sort of figured this RSS2 item was hook is what I was going to need. And so that's what I decided on. And then, of course, as you are working with your code and testing your plugin, you'll see if the thing is showing up how you want it to show up or if you need to find a different hook. So the first thing then that I'm going to do here is we're going to use this add action and we're going to hook into RSS and it's to_item. And then we are going to, the callback function or callback method in this case is going to be our add image method. So we're going to do array this and then add _image. And when you're working with classes, this is pretty much the way you do it. You have to do it inside of WordPress. Instead of just putting a function name, you do array this and then the method name. If you were outside of this over here, you would do add action RSS to item, and instead of referencing this, you would reference the object that we just instantiated, and then you would use the method name. So like that. But since we're inside, we're putting all of our hooks inside of, and you could certainly do that instead of putting your hook inside of the constructor if you wanted to. But since we're inside the constructor, we can just use this add image and that's going to reference this now. So that hooks us in, and then we need to go through and see about how we can add this image enclosure. Now an enclosure tag needs some very specific things. So for our image here, it needs the URL of the image. It needs the length in bytes, so essentially the file size, and then it also needs the type. And all of these things are required by the RSS standard. So we have to figure all of these things out, and we're going to use a bunch of WordPress plugins to help us do that. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to globalize post here, and this will give us access to all of the different data that's associated with this post. In this case, you probably don't need to do this. I have this thing about being explicit with certain things because the way this is, we're sort of inside of a loop, even though we're in the RSS feed, and so you actually do have access already to some of this stuff, and you can just call some of these methods or some of these functions that we're going to go through without having to pass in the post ID. But again, I'm explicit about things as much as possible. So I like to go ahead and globalize it here and actually use it in these functions. It'll make a little more sense as we get into this, but we're going to globalize post first, and then we need to check and see if this particular post even has a featured image. And so I'm going to do if and function exists, and we're going to do has post thumbnail. So this is hasPost thumbnail is a built-in WordPress function that will basically return true or false based on whether or not this post has a featured image associated with it. Now I'm doing if function exists, and I'm checking to see if the function exists first. hasPost thumbnail has been around for a while, so you probably don't need to do that. But again, it's one of those things where I never know what could happen in the future, and I would rather check in case for some reason that function goes away or something happens. I would rather check to make sure it exists, and then we'll just fail sort of silently than to cause a big error on the page. So I have just developed sort of a habit of doing this. So we're going to check if it exists first, and then if it does, we're going to actually run it. And here, this is where we can pass in our post ID. Now, again, you don't probably need to do this because the hasPost thumbnail will just assume the current post if no post ID is passed. And since we're looping through our posts here, it'll just assume whatever post you're looping through at that time. But again, I just like to be explicit, so that's why I go ahead and pass in the post ID. Feel free to kind of handle that however you want. All right, so if we have a thumbnail, then we need to actually go and figure out all the data that we need. So the first thing that we need is the URL. Now, this is sort of there's a trail of functions in order to get to this point. Ultimately, the one that we're going to use is WP get attachment source. And let me see if right here, WP get attachment source. And what this returns to us is it returns to us the URL, it returns to us an array, and then the URL, the width, height, and this sort of icon, or this is intermediate thing here. Ultimately, all I really care about is the URL here. Okay, so we want to get to this function here, but you'll notice it needs attachment ID. So I got to get the attachment ID first. And so in order to get the attachment ID, I need to use another function first, and that's get post thumbnail ID. And so what get post thumbnail ID does is if you pass in the post ID, which we know we have access to you, then it's going to return to you, the ID of the post or an empty string on failure, etc. So the way this ultimately works is it's going to give us the ID of the attachment. And so that's what we ultimately need. So we gotta sort of two-step this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set our attachment ID. And we actually need our attachment ID in another place as well as we go through this. So it's good to get it here. So we're going to get post thumbnail ID, and we're going to pass in the post ID. And so that simply is going to get us the attachment ID of the post thumbnail for this post. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then next we're going to get the actual data. So featured image equals, and this is where we're going to use WP get attachment image source. It's a long sort of function here, and then we're going to pass in here the attachment ID, and then we're going to pass in what WordPress has different versions of an image that you can grab. So here we're just going to get post thumbnail. There's a few by default. When you use the image editor, you'll notice you can use large, medium, thumbnail, and then when you create a plugin or a theme, you can also use add image size to add custom ones. So there's a number of things that you could put in here, but I really just want the thumbnail, so I'm just going to put post thumbnail. Okay, and so that again is going to return to us this array, which gives us URL, width, height, and this is intermediate. All I really need is the URL. So what I'm going to do after this is set URL equal to featured image, and the array that it returns is index, and URL is at the first position, so featured image 0. So that's going to give us our URL. That's the first thing that we need for our enclosure is the URL. So again, we're checking to see if there's a thumbnail. If there is, we're going to get the attachment ID of the post thumbnail, and then we're going to use that to help us get the actual URL of that post thumbnail. So that's what's happening in those steps. Now what we need to do is we need to get the length. So we're going to use we're going to set length equal to, and we're going to use a PHP function called file size. But file size doesn't take the URL of the file to get the file. It needs the path. So now we got to get the path, and there is a function called getAttachedFile. And so you can pass in the attachment ID, and what it will return to you is the file path to the attached file. So that's exactly what we need. And so we're gonna run file size on top of getAttachedFile, and what we're gonna pass in is what I showed you before, attachment ID. So again, getting that attachment ID, we've so far used it in 2 different places here. So important to grab that right off the top. All right, the final thing then, so that's going to give us what we need in terms of our length for our enclosure. The final thing that we need is we need the type. So what type of file it is. And we want to try and be accurate here and actually tell RSS the right thing. And so again, fortunately, WordPress has a function called getPostMIME_type. So you can pass in the ID of a post or attachment, and it will give you the MIME type. Now you see here it says this function can be used with any post type, but it makes more sense with attachments, right? With images and whatever else may be attached. So that's the function that we want to use here. So we're going to set type equal to getPostMIME_type. And again, what we're going to pass in is our attachment ID. Right, so that gives us everything that we need now. We have the URL, we have the length, and we have the type. Now we just need to build our enclosure. So I'm going to use printf. In this particular hook, sometimes with hooks you need to return data, and sometimes you need to actually echo out or print out the data. Here we want to print out the data, so I'm going to use printf as opposed to sprintf and then returning. And we're just going to build our enclosure tag. So we're going to use our format, which would be enclosure, and then it's going to be URL equals, and put in our first placeholder. Oh, and then it's going to be type or length equals second placeholder, and then we're going to have type equals and our final third placeholder. And then we close our tag. Okay, so this is our tag. This is the enclosure tag that we actually need to build. We're using printf, so we put placeholders in there. These are all strings. Actually, length is probably an integer, but we'll leave it like that for now. And then what we need to do is we need to specify where that data actually comes from. Well, we already said all that. So URL, that'll be put into the first placeholder where URL is set equal to, so that will drop in there. And then we're going to do length, so that will drop into the second placeholder, and then finally type. And so that will build us our enclosure, and that's it. That is the plugin. So again, we're checking to see if it exists, if their post thumbnail exists. If it does, we're getting the URL, the length, and the type, and then we're printing all that out, putting in that data where it needs to go in our enclosure tag. And so what this should ultimately do then is this should create us an RSS feed that has that enclosure in it. So I'm going to pop this over here. I've actually uploaded this to my site, a couple things over here I'll show you. All right, so I've uploaded this to the site. I do not have it turned on yet. Let me just refresh. I was messing with this a little bit earlier, so let me just double check, but pretty sure it is not turned on, okay? And if we go to RSS preview over here, let me re-grab that feed. and we'll view code. And what we're looking for, I happen to know this because I've done through this, but enclosures will show up under this links section here. So if we had our enclosure showing up the way we wanted it to, it would be showing up under here. You can see there's no image enclosure under here. So what we'll do is I'll come back over here and I will activate this plugin. And we'll go back to RSS preview and we will grab that again, view code, and come down to the links area. And you can see here now we have our enclosure. So we have our URL, we have our type, which is image/PHP, which is correct. We have it's an enclosure, and we have our length here, which is the file size. So that is what we needed. That's what I needed for this particular from this particular plugin, and that is how to build a plugin that allows you to do this. So, maybe you're having this specific problem, or maybe just learning more about how to build WordPress plugins. Whatever it is, hopefully you got something out of this. If you did, please be sure to like the video if that's the case. Also, if you'd like to take my, I have a full WordPress course where I actually teach you how to build sort of a fuller, more robust plugin. It's a contact form plugin and teaches you a lot about custom post types and working with different functions and classes and so forth inside of WordPress and so forth. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can go to johnmorrisonline.com/WordPress. I think the big thing with that is, yeah, we build a contact form plugin, but it's really teaching you sort of the fundamentals of WordPress plugin building. So if that's something you want to get into, I would suggest taking a look at that. Again, johnmorrisonline.com/WordPress. All right, that'll do it for this tutorial. Like I said, if you liked it, be sure to hit the like button. If you want to be notified when I post more tutorials like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so that you actually get notified and all that. And if you have any questions or comments, by all means, leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer those. All right, thanks for watching. We'll talk to you later.